I mean, so many photographers have hit up all of these locations. So it's really kind of difficult to put your own spin on it. And it's pretty much been shot at every angle in every sort of condition. I guess in a sense, there's no way that you can have an original image, but somehow you manage to have an original image because it's your own. You shot it. I'd like to have a clearly defined style when it comes to my post processing. It's kind of like what I'm feeling. Like I want someone to see that and say, oh, Rylan definitely took that picture. It's definitely difficult to put your own spin on things, and it's taken me quite a while to be able to do that.
Hey, welcome to episode 382 of the Beginner Photography Podcast, brought to you by CloudSpot, the easiest and all-in-one solution for photographers to deliver and sell your photos online. I am Raymond Hatfield, your host, and today we are chatting with wildlife and landscape photographer Rylan Meadows about capturing compelling wildlife and landscape photography. Now, Rylan is a pretty interesting guy. It is clear that he has just an absolute love and passion for photography and just loves to talk about it and share his ideas with others. Now, Rylan has a YouTube channel where he takes you behind the scenes of shooting landscapes, of shooting wildlife. And even though I'm not a wildlife photographer, his insights are both interesting and entertaining at the same time. And so I know that you are going to enjoy this interview because he brings that same passion into this conversation as well. So with that, let's go ahead and get on into today's podcast with Rylan Meadows. Rylan, I just want to know, when did you know that photography was going to play an important role in your life?
Well, I got my first camera on Christmas Day of 2018. And so throughout 2019, I just kind of spent my time focusing on learning camera settings and just kind of shooting a little bit of everything that I've seen, especially outdoors. And then the pandemic started obviously in 2020. And I think when I got to the end of 2020 and I was still doing photography, I've been stuck in my house all year. I think at that point I realized, well, if I can do this being stuck at home all year, I think I can do this for my whole life. So that's when I thought that photography was going to have an impact on my life.
Now, those early days when you said you got that camera and you're trying to figure out settings, there's kind of the two camps in photographers, right? The people who get the camera, just set it to auto, and they're like, this is great, this is all that I needed. And then those who do decide to take more of a controlled approach. So why did you decide that learning camera settings and taking control of your camera was important to you?
I wanted full control of kind of what my final image was going to look like. I didn't want the camera to decide that for me. I didn't want to just hold my camera up to my eye and press a button. So I started shooting in shutter priority mode, and I was just adjusting my shutter speed for a long time. And then, I slowly worked my way up to aperture priority, and then I kind of learned about f-stop. And so I started with shutter speed and learned how to control shutter speed. Then I learned about f-stop. Then eventually I moved into manual mode, and I took full control of my shutter speed and my f-stop. And then I started playing with the ISO as well. So it was really just important for me to learn how to create the image and make it look how I wanted to look.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that your images, that you were able to better capture the images that you wanted to in shooting in manual mode?
At first, not necessarily. It took a lot of getting used to different camera settings and stuff, but now I can definitely make the photo look how I want it to by shooting in manual.
Yeah. So when you were first kind of starting out, you said that you were shooting a lot of photos outside. Tell me about that. What were you shooting specifically?
I live on a farm in Kentucky, so I was shooting a lot of landscape photos. There's a forest around my home. I would go out into the woods and shoot out there a lot. There's a lot of wildlife around my house, wild turkey, white-tailed deer, a variety of species of songbirds. So that's primarily what I was shooting outside. Of course, I would also go on hikes and stuff. I'm really close to the Red River Gorge in Kentucky, if anyone's familiar with that area. So I would go out there and shoot a lot as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I see. Now, you kind of went through that year, right? You were learning the camera. You went through the pandemic. You shot a lot. And at the end of the year, you decided, I think I'm going to continue on with this. That was still focused on, say, outdoor nature, wildlife photography. Was it a little bit more defined than that? Or is it a pretty wide range there?
Even now, I still shoot a pretty broad range. I think if I had to pick one thing that I would shoot, it would definitely be wildlife. I've even did outdoor portrait photography. That's a really nice way. I kind of run a local business, and that's a really nice source of income for me as a college student. But if I could pick one thing, it would definitely be wildlife. But I still shoot a broad range of landscapes and wildlife and portraits. Like I said, I mean, I've not really narrowed it down, and
Why
I enjoy that.
wildlife? Why?
I mean, I think each and every individual animal kind of has their own personality. So it's really interesting for me to kind of not only necessarily capture a photo of the animal, but to kind of study and learn about it. That's just something that's always fascinated me. I love the outdoors, and to be able to look through a telephoto lens and capture an animal up close and see their expressions and kind of get led into their inner thoughts, that's something that's just really unique to me.
Yeah, yeah. I know that I don't do a lot of, actually, I don't do any wildlife photography, but looking at like a really good photo of an animal is, there's something about it that lets you connect to it in a way that I guess you don't normally do. At least I don't in nature. When I look at an animal, I just think, oh, that animal is just going about its day, I suppose. But there's something about a photo that maybe it's just that certain moment that, I don't know, let you think deeper. Like, what is that animal thinking about? So I see what you're talking about there. But I know that wildlife can be difficult to find, right? Because it's not like they have schedules or anything like that. So that aspect of it, trying to find animals to shoot on top of still trying to learn your camera, I'm sure made it extremely difficult. What were some of those challenges that you faced when it came to learning the photography side while, trying to find these animals to shoot?
Yeah, it was really challenging at first. I knew a decent amount about wildlife, but I didn't really like sort of get into necessarily all of like what you needed to know about wildlife till I was trying to take photos of them. So it was really frustrating, trying to learn how to adjust my settings, trying to learn how to shoot and make an image look how I wanted to. And then I would take one step too close to an animal and it would run away, or I would make one small noise, step on the wrong twig, and it would a bird would fly away. So that was very frustrating at the start. I've learned further into my career to kind of shoot more out of a photography blind. So you just kind of sit still and wait on animals to come to you rather than going out to them. But that was something that I definitely struggled with at the beginning, trying to learn how to photograph the animals while also adjusting my settings.
Yeah, geez. I don't know if I have the patience to sit out there. I'm
Yeah.
sure that you're out there for a while, right?
Oh yeah. When I sit in the blind, I can be out there from anywhere to like an hour, which isn't that long. And then I've been out there for like 6, 8 hours. It's crazy. Luckily, I've got a fairly big blind, so I can kind of move around and stuff, and I don't necessarily have to stay seated. But it can get boring at times if there's no wildlife.
Yeah, I bet. And you got to keep your eyes peeled the whole time because
Yeah.
I guess they're small animals. That's funny. What about the photography side of it? Like when it came to the settings, was there one particular that was difficult for you to kind of really get a grasp on for a while?
I think ISO was kind of a really difficult thing for me to kind of grasp because shooting when I first started with a beginner DSLR, I didn't really kind of understand the concept of noise. So a lot of the times I would shoot on auto ISO, and when I would get above 800 ISO on like my Nikon D3500, my photos would look really grainy, and I would be like, "Well, why does it look like that?" And I didn't understand, and I had to do a lot more research. And then I was like, oh, it's because my ISO is too high. And so then I would have to bring my f-stop down more, my shutter speed down more. And it was very frustrating to kind of get a hold of that and learn how to make that better.
How did you do that? Did you just upgrade your camera, or did you figure something else out?
YouTube.
You do.
I learned so much about photography on YouTube. Two photographers that have really taught me a lot are Tony and Chelsea Northrup. They're really big in the industry. I learned so much from watching their YouTube videos. Luckily, I didn't upgrade my camera or anything. I wasn't somebody that was like, oh, if I upgrade my camera, I'm just gonna be so much better. I just kind of learned to try to not go over 800 ISO, which can be really frustrating if you're shooting in a low lighting environment, especially for wildlife. So I would primarily shoot in golden hour light and not have to worry about it being too dark or anything. So yeah, I didn't upgrade a camera or anything. I just kind of had to play it by ear as I went, and it worked out for me.
Yeah, yeah. Learning to see light, recognize light. It's funny. I've said it that it's really hard because we see light technically everywhere, right? That's how we see. But it's not until you start to look for it with intention that it really starts to make sense because that's just like that next step. You know what I mean? Like we see it everywhere, but actually taking the time to pay attention and look at it is really when kind of everything starts to open up. So I think that's really cool that you took the time to look for light rather than just say, well, if I just spend more money, maybe I'll be able to take more photos. Because that, honestly, I mean, that was one of my first reactions when I first got into photography and I started to run into issues like that. And you'd think if I get a better camera, it's going to take better photos because that's what pros use. But obviously, that's not always the case. But you did upgrade at some point, right? What are you shooting with now? And tell me, why did you decide to upgrade?
Oh, I am shooting with my all-time dream camera right now. I'm shooting with a Nikon Z9, and I just love it so much. I initially upgraded from my D3500 in, I believe, 2021, and I upgraded to a Nikon D500 because at the time I was primarily shooting wildlife, and that was one of the best DSLRs that Nikon had as a crop sensor camera to shoot wildlife. And I still totally recommend that camera to people that are really passionate about shooting birds and wildlife because it's great. But at the end of the day, it was getting to the point where I wanted to upgrade and have something nicer. I wanted something that made my life a little bit easier in terms of autofocus. And up until the release of the Nikon Z9, there wasn't really anything in Nikon's mirrorless system that was going to be great for birds and wildlife. And of course, the Nikon Z9 still has its flaws, but it makes my life way easier. A lot of the times, I don't necessarily have to hurry and try to move a focus point to a bird. It'll even like detect it for me, and it's great. So when I decided to upgrade, my main purpose for doing so was definitely for better and quicker autofocus.
Oh, I see. I don't even know if I've ever thought about it. So it locks on to animals, like animal faces, like the autofocus?
Yes, it's pretty
Wow.
crazy. It'll even lock onto like a little songbird's eye. Of course, you have to be decently close for it to be able to lock
Sure.
onto the eye, but it can like detect their body and stuff from a pretty good distance. It's very impressive what mirrorless cameras can do for birds and wildlife these days.
Oh, that is cool. That is cool. So the D500, though, you mentioned that you'd still recommend it for, you said for new photographers getting into birding. Why that one as opposed to the, or I guess what was it about the you said the D500 that you liked over the 3500? Did I get those numbers right?
Yes, that was
Okay.
right. So for the D3500, it was a great camera. If you're getting into photography, even now, it's still great. It's a little bit older, but when you're kind of getting to the point where you want to be more serious about it and get into birds and wildlife in particular more, the D500 has a really great autofocus system, especially if you're upgrading from like a beginner DSLR. It's great. It has 3D tracking as a DSLR, and it's got all sorts of different focus modes that can be really great for birds. One of the popular ones that I would use was group focus, especially dealing with like a bird in flights. It's just a superb camera. And on top of that, it's still a crop sensor format. So you can get further reach on your full frame lenses, which is something that was important to me at the time as a bird and wildlife photographer. It can get me closer to the subject. So you don't have to have like a 600 millimeter lens to get good a good like long focal length. You can just have like a 300 millimeter lens and you can still get more than 300 millimeters because you're shooting on a crop sensor, assuming your lens is full frame.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a hard thing for a lot of new photographers to figure out because I guess there's just this idea that full frame is the best, so you got to go for full frame. But when you really do need that reach to get far away, you found that the crop sensor worked best for you. So now that you upgraded to a full frame camera, is the way that you get around that just buy longer lenses?
I have a 200 to 500 millimeter lens, and that's what I primarily use to shoot birds of wildlife. So it's very handy. I don't really notice much of a difference now, but luckily my full frame camera has more megapixels than my crop sensor did. So if I need to crop in and get closer in post, I can. But as a beginner, I still think I made the right decision shooting crop sensor because it got me closer and I didn't have to worry about cropping in because I didn't have as many megapixels on that camera. I still think that a crop sensor has its purposes and it worked
Yeah.
well for me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. I want to know because so I checked out your YouTube channel and you got a lot of videos out there. And just a few days ago, I watched the one where you went on like this whole road trip through, I think it was the Tetons, Yellowstone, and Glacier National Park. Is that right?
Yes, that was a
Okay.
fun trip.
I want to talk about that because that is something that I know a lot of people would love to do, right? But there's a lot of pressure, I'm sure, right? When you have to travel for photography in a number of areas. One, obviously, you got to just carry all your gear, but then there's also this pressure to perform, right? So for this trip, I guess, can you tell me a little bit more about it? And did you have a goal for the trip as far as photography wise?
Yeah, so the trip actually started off very rocky and it was actually very frustrating at the beginning. If anyone remembers the historic flooding that happened in Yellowstone last year, I arrived just days after that flood. So Yellowstone was actually closed when I arrived on that trip. And that was supposed to be the first place that I was going, the south entrance of Yellowstone and spending time in the South Park. And I actually couldn't do that at all. So I just had to spend time at state parks around the area. So that was very frustrating to me because there wasn't necessarily a set in stone goal for the trip, but I was really hoping to get some good photos of bears and just other types of wildlife that was most prevalent in Yellowstone. And unfortunately, that didn't happen because I didn't get to spend as much time there as I wanted to. But yeah, there was definitely a lot of pressure for me to kind of perform. I knew that people were going to be looking on social media and seeing what I was up to on there. And I've developed a decent following on Instagram and YouTube. And so there's definitely people that kind of expect me to perform in like a really great way. And that pressure can get to me sometimes. And on that trip, it was kind of stressful, even though it was like a vacation for me. I was doing a lot of work. And the fact that I wasn't able to get in Yellowstone, it was very stressful because it was like, am I still going to be able to get good photos on this trip?
How do you handle that stress of knowing that somebody is expecting certain photos out of you?
I try to just take photos for me. I like to say that photography brings me fulfillment. I'm not taking pictures to feel fulfilled, it brings me fulfillment. And so I kind of try to get in my mind and say, you're doing this for you, you're not doing it for other people. Of course, that can be difficult at times when people are constantly like, oh, you've not posted. Where have you been? Are you taking photos? But I try to remember that at the end of the day, I'm doing this for me and not for an audience.
That's a hard thing to do, especially I think
Yeah.
after time where you start to kind of build up a bit of a following, and also being a small business owner, and you feel that you got to share stuff, otherwise people forget about you, which isn't always the case. Obviously, if people are commenting on your stuff saying like, hey, like we missed your stuff, they
Yeah.
haven't forgot about you. But I understand that pressure. So do you ever feel like when you go out, well, I guess let's stay on this pressure thing for a moment, because again, wildlife is so unpredictable. You don't know when it's going to come out. Like, has there ever been times where you go out and expecting, I don't know, moose or something, and all you see is just ducks? Like what do you do?
So many times. And at this point, I've kind of just learned to adapt. It's like I don't know what I'm gonna see. Like I would love to go out and photograph a deer every time I'm out in the field, but chances are that's just not gonna happen. So I've learned to shoot what I see and just be thankful for what I see. Because so many times I'll go out and not even see anything, and it's like, well, I'm out here to photograph wildlife, and there's no wildlife. So what do? And that's very frustrating. But at the end of the day, anytime I go out on a shoot and I can find a subject to photograph, it's a good day. So I just kind of adapt. And although I might have something that I would like to see, it doesn't always happen. So I just make the best out of it.
That's awesome. So you wanted to see a bear. You did not see a bear. Tell me about how you adapted in that situation.
It was very frustrating to me because I was so confident that if I had, and even now, I still think, well, if I could have spent the 2 weeks, the week and a half in Yellowstone that I had originally planned to spend there, I'm fairly certain that I could have had an encounter with some sort of bear, whether it be a black bear or a grizzly bear. I feel like I could have seen something. So even now, that's still frustrating for me. But I try to remind myself, even if I would have got to spend all that time there, there was no guarantee that I was going to see a bear. So even though I had that kind of pre-expectation in my mind, it's like, well, there's no guarantee that was going to happen anyways. So I try to remind myself of that, but it can still be frustrating when that's what you want to see and it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, of course. What were some of your favorite photos from that trip then?
Oh my gosh, I got a really great sunset photo of the Tetons. So that's actually landscape. I got some great wildlife photos of elk. I got a really unique photo of Lake McDonald at Glacier National Park with the beautiful colored rocks in the foreground. There were so many beautiful images that I did get to create. Even though I didn't get to see that bear, I'm still very happy with the results that I had from that trip.
Yeah, that's good. Why those places? Why Tetons, Yellowstone, and Glacier, and not somewhere else like, I don't know, Arcadia or Yosemite or something? Why did you choose those locations?
I've always wanted to go to Yellowstone. So my main primary location that I wanted to spend time at on the trip was Yellowstone. And then of course that didn't get to happen due to the flooding, which is totally fine. I understand you can't control nature. It happened. It is what it is. But two of the closest parks to Yellowstone are actually Glacier National and the Tetons. The Tetons are south of Yellowstone and Glacier National is north. So I wanted to spend time in those as well because I've loved the landscape photos that I've seen on social media from the Tetons. And I was like, well, if I can have a chance to create my own version, my own spinoff of photos like this, I should totally take it. And then I was very excited to go to Lake McDonald as well and see those colorful rocks in person. And so that's definitely why I picked those. They were pretty close to Yellowstone, which was my main focus. So that was a huge reason as well. But I was also really fascinated in the beauty of those parks.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they are beautiful locations, and they're places where I'd love to go and visit as well. But when it comes to shooting in, say, Yellowstone or something like that, or going out and taking these photos, I'm curious to know, like, you take the photos, hold on. I guess let me formulate this question because
You're good.
um, there is an investment to fly to these places. There's an investment in time to shoot these photos. There's an investment in energy as well. And as a photographer, how do you determine whether or not that investment paid off? Is it in a monetary sense or is it in a fulfillment sense? Or could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, for me, it's definitely in the fulfillment sense. Seeing a monetary kind of feedback from that as well is obviously nice. But for me, it's definitely kind of the feeling that I get when I capture the photos. And then, of course, if I do choose to share those on social media and other people seem to have like the same feeling, if they're like, oh, this image really speaks to me, that's really nice as well. Just kind of seeing the support that other people will be willing to give to those photos. It makes it kind of worth it for me as well. I like to be able to make people feel like they're in a location without ever having to step foot in it. And when I can do that and I can feel fulfilled myself at the same time from a photo I'm creating, I feel like it's worth the investment.
You mentioned that you saw a number of these locations on Instagram before you had went and you thought, I'd love to kind of put my spin on it. What is your spin? How do you take a location like, forgive me, I don't know what it's called, but there's that barn in front of the Tetons, right? It's been photographed a million times. How do you go into it and try to put your own spin on it?
I mean, so many photographers have hit up all of these locations. So it's really kind of difficult to put your own spin on it. And it's pretty much been shot at every angle in every sort of condition. So I guess in a sense, there's no way that you can have an original image, but somehow you manage to have an original image because it's your own. You shot it. I'd like to have a clearly defined style when it comes to my post processing. I've created presets that I use. So I'll do like an original edit and then I'll apply my preset to that to kind of make my photos look bright, vibrant. That's my style. I like bright and vibrant. Of course, there are so many other photographers that do that and have that same style. But for me, it's kind of like what I'm feeling. Like I want someone to see that and say, oh, Rylan definitely took that picture. And of course, if you've seen one of my photos compared to like 1,000 other photos of that same location, you're not going to be able to pinpoint mine most likely and say, oh, Rylan took that one. But if you're scrolling through social media and you're like scrolling through a bunch of different photographers that you follow, I want you to be able to stop, see a photo that I posted and say, oh, Rylan definitely took this one, and then scroll up and it says Rylan's amazing photography on the tagline. So it's definitely difficult to put your own spin on things. And it's taken me quite a while to be able to do that and formulate that. But at the end of the day, I want to be able to have a defined look to my photos.
What do you think was missing from your photos, say in those early days, that you have found now that feels like you have more of a stamp on your images?
Definitely just kind of a standard. Like one of my photos could look entirely different from another one. And that wasn't even necessarily because of what I was doing in camera, but it could also be what I was doing out of camera. I didn't fully understand composition, so I would be trying a bunch of different things. So things would be differently composed. And of course, I still do that now. But I was just trying so many different compositional techniques. In terms of post processing as well, I would try so many different ways of editing my images. And now, I've kind of got it narrowed down to different compositional techniques that I use most often, as well as the way that I edit my photos. Most of my photos are edited in the same way. So it's fairly obvious. You can tell that one photo goes with another of mine, even if they're totally unrelated and from different shoots.
Yeah, I always say that when it comes to editing, the way that I view it is more of like a stamp, right? Like, this is my shot. It's less about completely changing the image and more about kind of the maker's mark of an image to give it that visual look. But when you had first started and you're trying all these different edits and you're trying all these different compositions and whatnot, I know that it can be frustrating to look at somebody else's work and say, they've got it. Like they got this thing. Like it is so good and it is so clearly them. How did you get over that frustration or that roadblock? Like what kept you going versus, well, I'm clearly not at this point. So what am I even doing trying here?
I think looking at other photographers' work kind of kept me going. It was like, well, I want to be able to be that good one day. I want somebody to be able to like go to my profile or look at my photos and be like, oh, he's got it. And so that kind of just kept me motivated and kept me going. Not that photography is a competition, but that was it. It was very kind of inspiring for me to look at other photographers and be so amazed. And I would be like, oh, I want my photos to look like that. I want to have it together like that. And so at the end of the day, that was my motivation to keep going and try to get it together.
Yeah. Now, you said that you want somebody to look at your photos and say, like, he's got it. Outside of that, outside of understanding that you are a competent photographer, how do you want people to feel when they see your images?
Yeah, I don't want people to just look at my photos and be like, oh, I hope I'm as good as him one day. There are certain emotions that can even be evoked from a photograph. And I like my goal is when people look at my work, I want them to feel the same way about a photo that I feel. Of course, I totally understand that photography can have its own interpretations for every single person. So you're not necessarily going to look at a photo I took and feel the same way I feel because I was there, I was on location, and getting that emotion that you feel on location to transfer into a digital photograph that you share to the entire world can be extremely difficult.
Yes.
So I definitely like have an understanding that everybody isn't going to feel the same way about an image. But if even just one person feels the same way about my photo that I feel like I've did my job. I don't want people to just look at me and be like, oh, I want to be good like him one day. I want people to be able to enjoy my work and just kind of sit back and view it.
So if you want people to feel how you feel when you were there and when you shot it, can you kind of talk to me a little bit about that? Like, in what ways are you trying to bring that emotion into an image? I know that we talked a little bit before we started recording that you're in Arizona right now. Kind of tell me about that, because where you're at is like this, it's a very big and vast location. So how do you bring in the emotions that you feel when you get out there to shoot into your image?
Yeah, so there's a variety of ways that I do this. I can do this with the focal length of a lens. I can do this with my exposure time, with editing. Out here in Arizona, I'll use that as an example right now because I'm out here. There's so many colorful, beautiful orange and red rocks. So when I edit, when I go into Lightroom and I upload a raw file, it's not necessarily going to look exactly how it looked to me. It's not going to have that bright, popping look. It's actually pretty flat and monotone because it's a raw file. So I love to kind of bring it to life. I don't overdo saturation and vibrance, but I definitely pull those up quite a bit. Something that I like to use personally is clarity. I know some photographers don't like to use that, but it tends to work pretty well for me in my photos. So editing is a huge part of that for me.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that you spend a lot of time editing each image, or would you consider yourself a pretty quick editor?
Somewhere in the middle. I don't spend like 2 hours on a single image, but I'm also not just rushing through and like clicking a preset. I take my time. Anything that needs to be added to an image, not like photoshopped in, but like if there's like color or like light that I feel like should be a little more prevalent in one spot in the photo, I'm going to take my time and put that in. I'm not going to rush through it, but at the same time, I'm not willing to spend like 3 hours on a single photo. Not to say that I would never do that if it was some like amazing photo that I took that I was so proud of and never going to shut up about. Maybe I would spend that much time on that. But in general, no. It probably takes me an hour or two to edit most of my shoots in terms of landscape and wildlife, anyways.
When you first open up an image, what's the first thing that you do?
Ooh, that's a tough one. It honestly depends on the photo. I think the first thing is kind of make sure that my exposure is right. I want the image to look fairly balanced. I want the shadows to be obvious. I want the highlights to be obvious. I want you to be able to tell a difference. I don't want it to look flat and monotone. I want it to be vibrant. I want it to be bright. I want it to pop. And that way, so when I have a print on the wall, it pops. Like you're going to notice that when you walk in a room. When you're scrolling through social media and you see one of my photos online, it's going to pop. You're going to like stop and look at it. I want it to be very pleasing to the eye and I want it to kind of attract your eye to it.
I see. When you do go out and travel, are you a bring all the gear kind of photographer, or are you a I'm going to bring minimal gear and just make it work kind of a photographer?
This is a toxic trait of mine. I tend to overpack pretty much for every shoot because my mindset is, well, I would rather have too much than not enough, which, is a fair point. But when you have a 60-pound camera bag on your backpack, on your back, I mean, and you're 2 miles into a hike, you can kind of regret that in a sense. I don't want to not have enough, but I also tend to overpack when it comes to my gear. Like I could be going out on a landscape shoot and then bring like a telephoto lens because I'm like, well, what if I see an animal on the way there? In like an area that I know I'm not going to see an animal, but it's like, what if? So I tend to pack too much gear.
That is funny. I wonder what you would do. Like, I wonder how your approach would change if just once you went out on a hike and just brought just, I don't know, 24 to 70 or something and just see how it went. I wonder if that would just kill you inside. Like, oh, it's right there. I know that I have this lens that could get it perfectly, but I don't have it with me. Do you think that the pain of missing a shot would be worse than, I guess, spending more time enjoying the activity and still capturing a shot, even though it's not the best? Does that question make sense? That seems like a very long question.
No, I understand. It's kind of, I feel like I'll get over it. Like I feel like it would force me to be creative, especially if I just had like a 24 to 70 on my camera. And then like if I looked up and saw like a deer or a bear, I'm obviously going to be frustrated and be like, well, I have a 200 to 500 could get a perfect shot of this instead I'm standing here with a wide angled lens on. But I feel like it would be good for me as a photographer and it would force me to kind of be more creative. So I really need to try that. I mentioned earlier, we were talking before we started the show, I do enjoy to hike, and sometimes I'll go out on a hike and not have any camera gear. And then I'll see something and be like, oh, I wish I had my camera. I would so love to get a picture of that. But then it's kind of like, no, I'm out here right now to enjoy nature, not to work, even though it's like a hobby for me as well. It's kind of like I'm just out here to kind of relax and just enjoy the nature around me. And I can get over it when it's like that. But, if I had my camera and didn't have the right lens, I don't know. I would probably be frustrated, but it would be good for me.
Yeah. I would imagine that would be hard. Like when you put yourself in those boxes, like I'm here for a hike, it's easy to get over that I missed a shot. But if you're out there to shoot and you miss a shot, I'm sure that just feels a whole lot worse for sure. I kind of want to go back to these animals a little bit because, as we talked about, animals don't really have a schedule, right? So, is your approach to wildlife photography to just go out and just see what happens, or is there a little bit more planning as far as, I don't know much about animals, migration and knowing where they eat and drink and stuff, or how do you, I guess, stack the cards in your favor to make sure that you do try to walk away with an image that you can use?
You have to do a good amount of research and know the subject that you're shooting. That's something that I really kind of preach to anybody that asks me for advice on wildlife photography. You have to know your subject. It's very important to kind of understand the animal that you're shooting. Like I don't go out on a cold winter day and expect to see an indigo bunting, for example, because that's a summer bird. They're not going to be there in the winter. If I went out looking for that bird in snow, it would be pointless because it's not going to be in Kentucky during that time of year. So migration definitely does have an effect on it. Something else that's important to know is kind of for birds and wildlife, their behavior. Like you're not going to be able to get within 10 feet or probably even 20 or 30 feet of a deer. Whereas a bird, you can get a lot closer. You can get within 10 feet of a bird. It's important to kind of know what they're comfortable with. And that can't just be learned through research. It's a lot of kind of firsthand experience out in the field as well, learning and understanding what animals are comfortable with. And that can be very frustrating when you're first getting into that. But it's sort of a skill that you learn to develop and you kind of learn as you go.
Is it like, did you start with just one animal? Like, I'm going to learn a lot about deers here so that I can try to get better photos of deers. And then it grows into other animals? Or do you find that universally there's some sort of pattern between them?
For me, when I first started, I was trying to do everything. I didn't really have a focus on one animal. I was going out and I was like, oh, maybe I'll see this animal today. Maybe I'll see this bird today. And that can be great. But looking back on it, I think if I would have spent more time focusing on just one animal, I would have definitely probably learned quicker, at least for that species. And then once I've kind of mastered what I need to know about that animal, then move on to the next. And I'm not necessarily recommending to learn that way, learn at your own pace, do what you want to do. But for me, just kind of going out and shooting a bunch of different types of wildlife was challenging and it would be frustrating at times. But eventually I've learned a lot about all sorts of different species that I shoot in Kentucky, and it's worked really well for me.
Ah, gotcha. We touched upon this earlier. The patience that's involved, it could take hours. You've been out there for 6 hours. When do you know to move on?
When it gets dark. um, no, I mean, if I sit there for like 2 hours, honestly, and I don't hear any sound, there's no movement, it's kind of like at that point, it's like, well, wildlife just isn't out today. Sometimes you can go out and you just like don't hear anything in the forest. And it's kind of like at that point, you just got to accept you're not going to have any luck that day. And there's no point in sitting there. I don't want to say wasting your time because there's so much enlightenment that nature can bring you and just, being out in it. But if you're out there solely for the purpose of photography, if you sit there for 2 hours and you're not seeing any wildlife, you're just not having any luck. 2 hours is usually like my point where it's like, well, I'm out here to take pictures. I'm not being able to get good pictures. I think it's time to move on. If I'm not hearing anything or seeing anything, it's kind of like today's not the day. Let's give it another try tomorrow.
I see. Yeah, there's a little bit more nuance to it. And there's not a hard and fast rule. I see. Okay. How much longer are you in Arizona for?
I'm here until Sunday, so that's
A few
about,
days.
yeah, 4 or 5 more days.
I want to know, how are you going to judge whether or not the trip is a success?
Oh, I've taken so many photos already that I'm really proud of. I'm really happy that I've had the opportunity to take those. At this point, I think the trip's already worth it because I've taken so many photos that are just like I love. Like I've worked hard on this trip already and I've gotten some great photos that I'm really happy with. Like yesterday, I got photos of purple flowers that were blooming in a field like surrounded by red rocks. And that was just something that was kind of mind blowing to me. The photos that I've taken have already brought me a sense of fulfillment, which we kind of talked on earlier. And so I'm feeling fulfilled by my work. So in my interpretation, I think that this trip is worth it. I think it's worth the investment of this trip because I'm feeling good. It doesn't necessarily revolve around if others seeing my work like it. Of course, if they do, that's a nice added bonus, but I'm shooting for me. So it's definitely worth it.
So you got a few more days. What is on the schedule that you're excited to capture?
Today, actually, I'm going to a canyon. The name has slipped my mind, but I'm pretty excited about that. I'm going to Zion National Park tomorrow, I believe, and I'm probably going to try to hit up the Grand Canyon one day this week. I've been there before, so it's not as high on my list. It's a beautiful location, but I would love to spend some more time there. So, just kind of get out and explore and see an environment that's different to what I'm typically surrounded by every day. That's always pretty inspiring and motivational for me when it comes to shooting photos.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, animals, in a sense, are like people to where they move and they do things, and you can wait for a good moment, right? And capture that good moment. But when it does come to landscapes, I guess, how does moment play into your photos there?
Yeah, I mean, lighting is like crucial in my opinion for landscape photography. That's like the most important thing. Like you said in wildlife, they can somewhat be predictable. They're not really predictable, but it's kind of like I can expect in a sense what an animal's going to do, whereas a landscape I can't predict. The weather, I can't predict. Conflicts in nature, there could be a flood or something, or a landscape could look entirely different than what it did a year ago on an image that I was looking at on Instagram. So it's kind of just play it by ear.
Wow, I have never thought about it like that. That you can at least have some sort of idea of what an animal is going to do, but with nature, or I guess in landscapes, it's more difficult. Because I think the majority of people would think that landscapes would be easier in the fact that it's just not moving. But I mean, you're right. There's so many variables there that are impossible to control. That makes sense. That makes sense. What is something that you wish that you knew or understood earlier in your photography journey?
Probably composition. I tried for years to kind of like understand composition fully. There's so many different compositional techniques that you'll see people preach. And at the end of the day, the rule of thirds is a lovely compositional technique that I still use today. I think everybody can benefit from using the rule of thirds, regardless if you're a beginner or you're like the most advanced photographer, have more experience than anybody. So I wish I kind of understood that sooner. Perspective as well. Everything does not look the best from my level, especially when it comes to wildlife. That's something that I preach a lot. Oftentimes I'll squat down or get down on my stomach even and shoot up at an animal. For example, if you're looking up at a deer, that's going to catch people's attention because everybody sees a deer from above at an eye level or from above it. You're not really used to seeing a deer from a below angle. So it's going to catch people's attention. You don't just have to shoot at eye level. So composition is definitely something that I wish I'd kind of spent more time on mastering sooner.
Yeah. I've heard from a lot of listeners that composition is a very hard thing to understand, and I think part of it is that with light, you know that your settings have to change because your photo's either too bright or it's too dark. There's a test right there of whether or not your settings are good based on how bright or how dark your image is. But when it comes to composition, oftentimes I hear things like, "How do you know when to use what composition?" And it's a little bit more nuanced than that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it really just takes a lot of firsthand experience until you can do it. I mean, there's no one way to learn composition. Just get out in the field and shoot, and eventually you'll probably get the hang of it.
That's perfect. I couldn't have said it any better myself. Rylan, I know that we are at the end of our time here. People are listening. They're going to want to see some of your photos. They're going to want to learn more about you. Tell us what you got going on because you got a book as well. I want to hear about that. So tell us where we can find you online and where we can see more of your photos.
Yes, I just released my new book. It's titled To You From Me, and it's got a lot of my photography. It has a chapter on birds, two chapters on wildlife. It's got a chapter on landscapes, and it's got a chapter on lunar photography. It just released last Friday, so we're getting close to a week of its release at the time of filming this. I worked very hard on this for years, so it would mean a lot if anyone will go and check it out. You can find it on my website. You can go to www.rylansamazingphotography.com, and it's on there. It's on my homepage. There's also a section titled My Books above there. You can click, and it's on that as well. And it's also on Amazon. So if you just type "To You From Me," Rylan Meadows in the search bar on Amazon, it's the first result that pops up.
I had 3 big takeaways from today's interview with Rylan. The first one is that landscapes can be harder than wildlife. I think both in the sense that, if you know your subject isn't going to move and you have more time to create just the quote unquote best shot, that I feel like can cause some overwhelm, right? Because you're constantly tweaking the image, wanting to make it the best that it can be because you have this time. So why not use it to make the image better and better and better and better? But then there is a point of diminishing returns. But with wildlife, you do your best in the few seconds that you have with that animal, and that's what you got. The second takeaway that I have is putting your own spin on your photos when you visit a place that has been photographed a million times. Like Rylan said, even if a place has been photographed a million times by a million other photographers, just by you simply being there and you photographing it, you are going to be able to put your own spin on it. Now, it may not be something that is going to change the world completely, but it is going to have your style and your stamp on the image. And at the end of the day, that is what you want as a photographer, for your entire body of work to have that stamp and signature on your images. Now, my last takeaway here, number 3, is the importance of knowing your subject and how it acts. Now, that goes for everything, not just animals. You need to have a basic understanding of a wedding day timeline. You need to have a basic understanding of how many innings are left and what the count is for that college softball game that you're shooting. Or if the look in that moose's eyes is wonder or nervousness. Now, I've got links to everywhere that you can find Rylan in the show notes of this episode. Now, if you've got any questions about today's episode, anything that Rylan shared, or if you have feedback on the show, I want you to feel free to reach out to me directly at beginnerphotographypodcast.com, where you can shoot me an email or even better, a voicemail. And while you're there, be sure to download my free Picture Perfect Camera Settings cheat sheet with camera settings for more than 10 popular types of photography, filled with my own personal and professional images and the real-life camera settings that I used so that you can know where to get started. That is it for this week. Thank you again for tuning into this episode of the Beginner Photography Podcast, brought to you by CloudSpot. If you want to learn more about CloudSpot and grab your free forever account, just head over to deliverphotos.com. And remember, the more that you shoot today, the better of a photographer you will be tomorrow. Talk soon.
Thank you for listening to the Beginner Photography Podcast. If you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review in iTunes. Keep shooting, and we'll see you next week.